I don't go out of my way to watch a war movie. Many of them are not good, and the ones that are well made leave a lasting impression, causing sadness and an ache almost as real as the one that comes when you lose a loved one. But I don't actively avoid them either, and so when I came upon one that involved the fighting on the island of Saipan in World War II, I stuck with it, at least until I had to leave to go to work. As I was driving to work, I was thinking about that brutal war in the Pacific. Brutal war in the Pacific, right. And I remembered reading an essay about the battle on Okinawa by William Manchester. I felt I should return to that work and read it again. There was a succession of bitter battles in the Pacific in that war. Among them, Guadalcanal from August to February 1942-43, Saipan in June and July of 1944, Iwo Jima February and March of 1945, and finally Okinawa April to June of 1945. They approached ever closer to mainland Japan, and so the Japanese defended them ever more fiercely. On Okinawa they had extensive underground fortifications filled with soldiers whose orders were to fight to the death. The plan was to strike the U.S. naval support with kamikaze bombers, disabling or sinking them, isolating the soldiers on the island, and destroying them all. When the Marines landed on Okinawa, as they did with relative ease, the Japanese were ready for them. Manchester, who had previously been at Guadalcanal and Saipan, was one of them. His description of the island and the fighting that took place there is harrowing. The loss of life on both sides was terrible. 80% of Manchester's unit was lost. There was one critical enemy fortification that the Marines came to call Sugarloaf Hill. The fighting there was very intense, much of it hand-to-hand, involving bayonets, knives, handguns, and rifles. The Marines took the position, and lost it, about a dozen times before they finally overran their foes. Manchester says that it rained during this ferocious exchange, for a week, day and night, so much so that he wondered if it was possible that the fighting might stop, calling off the war on account of bad weather. It did not, and when the Marines finally took the hill, it was a horrifying slop of mud, blood, human waste, and rotting bodies, not the kind of place where you savor the thrill of victory. It was enough to cure Manchester of any notion he might have had about dulce et decorum est. A few days later he and some others were hit by a rocket mortar that killed the man in front of him, driving part of his shin bone into Manchester, along with a scrapyard full of shrapnel. Corpsmen later dug him out, blind and deaf and barely alive. Manchester says that many of the boys signed up to fight because of a movie, entranced by the heroic exploits and the uplifting sense of patriotism on the battlefield. In the actual war, like Chris Kyle, he felt only the impulse to kill the enemy and protect his fellow soldiers. Other than his admiration for his brothers in arms, most of whom were killed, he had little to say about war, except perhaps the word of cabron, merde. Yes, those movies about war. He and a buddy went to see one, The Sands of Iwo Jima, and they had to leave the theater because they couldn't stop laughing. He recounts an extraordinary time when, he says, I had the extraordinary pleasure of seeing John Wayne humiliated in person. The actor showed up at a military hospital in full cowboy regalia to boost the morale of the wounded. He stood before those men and said, "Hiya, boys," and was greeted by silence until someone booed, and then they all booed until he left. Some think there was a time when war was, as Churchill has it, magnificent. Churchill was never daunted by the loss of life. I see no glory in it before or now. In our wars now we have suicide bombers killing people in stores and on buses. We have remote-controlled drone planes and heat-seeking missiles, and there is no glory in that. Manchester concludes that the war was necessary. To that I will echo his merde. He also says that some wounds never heal. Of that I'm certain. If all Americans understood the nature of battle, he says, they might be vulnerable to truth. Maybe. I doubt it. Truth isn't strong enough to stop a war. When war comes, it comes. And sooner or later, it comes.